Delegations from the United States and Ukraine are headed toward the Middle East. Actually, both of them are already in Saudi Arabia already. Volodymyr Zelensky himself is going to be meeting with Prince bin Salman to try and talk some issues about his side. Secretary Rubio is meeting several Saudi Arabian folks today to talk about some of the U.S. issues. And then tomorrow in Jeddah, there's supposed to be a meeting between the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side. Unfortunately, there seems to be a rather big gap in what they're supposed to accomplish there and what we're going to be doing going forward. To try and make some sense out of what all these different sides are saying and what we might can expect to come out of this meeting, we have back with us Colonel Jacques, retired former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service and NATO officer and author extraordinaire of a number of books. So, Colonel, first of all, just welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again back into your show. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you on because you always kind of cut right to the chase and you can pierce through a lot of the nonsense that people are saying. Of course, you also have really good views on some of the things from the European side that we might not have as much over here on our side of the pond. But so I want to ask you just first of all, just what are your general expectations? Because you see that initially Zelensky was reported anyway to be meeting with the United States delegation while he was here. But then I guess about 2 days ago, they said, well, actually, he's not going to talk to the U.S. We're just going to talk to his worker bee staff. But Zelensky's still going to go and talk to bin Salman. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure about the objective of this meeting. My understanding is that the U.S. wants to convince the Ukrainians to go on the negotiation table with the Russians. The problem is that the Ukrainians don't want to talk to the Russians because they know that if there is any discussion, they have no cards. And at the end of the day, what will happen at the end of the negotiation is that will be on Russian terms. And for that reason, they are reluctant to go and negotiate. And also the reason why they have, in fact, the support of the European Union for not talking to the Russians. And therefore, there is, I think, a discrepancy between the expectations of the US because Trump departed from the idea that both sides at one point want to have peace. The problem is that what is considered as peace is not exactly the same for the Ukrainians as for the Russians. The Russians see peace starting from the situation we have on the ground, meaning the 4 oblasts occupied by Russia occupying a part of the territory, and in fact what Vladimir Putin described on the 14th of June 2024 with the officials of the foreign minister. For the Ukrainians, peace means the return to the situation of 1991 or 2014. And that's where you have this gap, because obviously what the Ukrainians expect, and remember the victory plan of Zelensky, it was in essence to return to the situation of 1991. And we don't see exactly how they want to achieve that, because they have absolutely no leverage to force the Russians to go along with this idea. So this is, and I think Zelensky has still in mind this. So when he talks about peace, he talks about a kind of illusionary peace in a beautiful a pink world in which everything was nice, like in Disneyland, but the reality on the ground shows that you had a lot of blood that has been shed in the last 3 years, and the Russians, because they have been fooled by the Europeans and Boris Johnson in particular in April 2022, and fooled before that with the Minsk agreement, the Russians are not going to forget that. And for them, it's clear that if any negotiation happen, they have to happen based on the situation we have on the map today.
I want to go down that path for a second. Something you said at the first part there just a second ago got my attention, because you said it's not just Zelensky, but also many in the European Union who don't want to talk to Russia because they know that it would be, on Russia's favor. It would end up in their camp, etc. But isn't that something like, say you're in a school bus or a truck, you go about halfway over a railroad crossing, your car stops, you look to your left and there's an engine coming down the road and it's blaring down, and you don't want it to hit your car. Of course, you can't get it off. So you go, okay, I'm just going to cover my eyes so I don't see the train, and then everything will be fine. Because whether you want to acknowledge with your mouth that Russia has the leverage, they still do.
Well, this is something like this. Now, we have also to understand that in the US, you change the administration. I mean, now you have the Trump administration, and Trump doesn't recognize this conflict or this war in Ukraine as his war, if you want. For him, this is a liability. This is a legacy from the Biden administration. He considered that as a poor decision making, bad decisions, and therefore he doesn't want to acknowledge ownership. He has no ownership for this conflict, if you want. And of course, he can afford to do that because of the changes that happened since end of January this year. The Europeans on their side, they cannot do that because they have been along with the Ukrainians in this conflict since the very beginning, and they have been even more royal than the king, royalist than the king, or more Catholic than the Pope, in the sense that they even convinced Zelensky not to sign an agreement with the Russians. So meaning that they have made decisions. They are part of the decision making that led to this situation. And today, for them, it's very hard to go backwards. Trump doesn't have this problem. You can say, well, that's legacy thing. It's a legacy from Biden. I don't want this. This is not my conflict. I want to get rid of that. I don't want to spend resources, money, equipment, or whatever for this conflict. It's a black hole. We are just losing things. That brings absolutely nothing, and therefore we have to stop it. And that's absolutely consistent. It's a new administration. If you look at Emmanuel Macron, for instance, he was one of those who were always pushing for this conflict, and even he made last Friday, he made an address to the French people where he explained his position, and we see that he's a warmonger. So how can he move backwards? It's very hard for him, and therefore they prefer to continue, even if they are going in the wrong direction. They don't want to contradict themselves. They don't want to lose face, because for them is an exercise in losing the face, which is not the case for Trump. So part of me can understand them not wanting to, but in my train coming down the road analogy, Russia still has that position. So if they keep with the fiction, I mean, they're going to play right into a physical defeat eventually. I mean, I don't see any other way around. Do you? Well, the problem is that they have lied since the very beginning. And, there is also something that needs to be taken into the equation. For the Russians entered in Ukraine to protect the Russian population in Ukraine. That's the reason for them to enter in Ukraine. There are background issues such as the NATO, the extension of NATO, and the willingness of Ukraine to enter NATO. And that's probably what prompted Zelensky to start the offensive against the Donbass early February 2022, before the Russians would attack. And in fact, that's what Zelensky did that triggered the reaction from the Russians. But the essence for the Russians is to protect their own, not their own citizens, because they were not their own citizens, but they are their
Ethnic brothers, yeah.
ethnic brothers, if you want. And in the West, we portrayed this attack as an attempt of Putin to extend Russia, to recreate the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
the Tsarist Empire, and of course, the idea of having a Russia that is, in essence, expansionist, that want to extend its sphere of influence, that want to regain the territories it lost in 1991 and things like this. This is a very something which is deeply entrenched in the European thinking, among the elite especially. The population doesn't care much, probably, but the elite is saying that. And in fact, in essence, that's what Emmanuel Macron said on Friday to his citizens. He said, well, we have to prepare for war, because after Ukraine, in essence, that will be the turn of Europe to be attacked by Russia. So we have this idea. But if we would go back, and even those who are critics of NATO and all that, they tend to say that Putin is attacking NATO, is reacting to NATO and all that. There is an element of truth in that, but it's very much in the background. The reason why the Russian soldier is ready to die today in Ukraine is because he's convinced he's protecting the Russian population of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And remember that when Russia entered in Ukraine, they invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter. I mean, that's the idea of helping a population which is in difficulty, which is basically the application of the principle of responsibility to protect that the Russians already invoked when they intervened in Georgia in 2008. So for the Russians, it's not really political per se. It's in fact something they feel they have a responsibility to protect those Russian citizens that were left after the disbandment of the Soviet Union. You had Russian minorities in the Baltic states, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and in Central Asia, and they feel they have a responsibility to continue to watch for these guys.
Yeah, and
So
and I think that's going to really get into a lot. I think that discrepancy between what's really Russia's drive and what we characterize as Russia's drive is also playing out in how the two sides are approaching the potential for negotiated settlement. So let's just for a moment, I want to look at how the Russian side is approaching this. And I'm going to show you a few clips of Sergei Lavrov over the last 2 or 3 weeks because his messages are completely consistent. They rarely, if ever, change. And this first one here is he's saying, we're not just looking for a ceasefire. We're not just looking for an end of the war. We want to address the root causes.
Yep. Absolutely.
Speaking of these unreasonable accusations of Russia that we are preparing for war against Europe and France, President Putin has said many times that this is absolute nonsense. And I think that any reasonable person would understand that Russia doesn't want any war. Russia wants to eliminate the root causes of the situation created by the West in Ukraine, in order to suppress the influence and essentially to wage war against Russia.
So he's I guess that really mirrors what you just said there. He wants the root causes. So in your understanding, what are the root causes from the Russian perspective?
Well, that's exactly that. The root causes are essentially the protection and basically the violence that was that started in 2014 against the population of Ukraine. And remember that you had, in March 2021, Volodymyr Zelensky issued a decree for the reconquest of Crimea and the south of the country. So and from that point on, you had the buildup of forces on the Ukrainian side at the border of Donbass. And that was in fact the preparation for an operation against the Donbass. In addition to that, there is something that our media never mentioned, that on the 1st of July, 2021, the Ukrainian parliament adopted a law that gives different rights to the Russian population as from other citizens of Ukraine, meaning that the Russians are considered as non-indigenous people, and therefore they cannot enjoy all the rights that normal Ukrainian citizen can enjoy. Imagine that in the US, if you had, for instance, African American having different rights. I mean, in the law, I'm not talking about what's happened in the reality, because that's probably to some extent what in certain situations happens. But in the law, every citizen is equal to others and have the right to equal rights. Now, and in Ukraine, this was exactly one of the problem, that the Russians are considered as second-class citizens, and that's just a glimpse at the situation of the Russians in Ukraine. And the Russian population in Russia, in fact, pressed Vladimir Putin to intervene much earlier in Ukraine, because precisely of that, because the situation of the Ukrainian Russians was very well known by the population in Russia itself. And they even, I remember when I was in Ukraine in 2014, there were huge pressure on the Russian side to effectively intervene. The Russians didn't intervene at that time in Ukraine. Even in Crimea, they didn't intervene per se. I mean, there were some troops in Crimea, and they were committed to, let's say, when you had a conflict between the population, because the Russian population rebelled against the new authorities, and then you had the repression. And Vladimir Putin authorized, as it was agreed on the status of force agreement signed by Russia and Ukraine before 2014, I think it was in 2010, you had the last SOFA signed by both parties. And according to the status of force, Russian forces were allowed to go out of their garrison to enforce law if there were some situation unrest as we had in 2014. And that's where you had the intervention of Russia, but you had no external. You had 25,000 soldiers stationed in Crimea. That was according to the SOFA. You had no additional forces coming from outside, as we tend to suggest in the media. Very important to say.
So, but all of that sounds to me like all of those conditions and desires on the Russian side still exist, and they haven't changed any.
Absolutely.
So any kind of negotiated settlement will still have to address those issues right now. Is that fair to say?
This is exactly that. They haven't moved their position 1 inch. This is exactly that. They want to preserve the integrity of the minority, the Russian minority in Ukraine. And that, by the way, that's also the reason why they want to keep the 4 regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That's the reason, because they perfectly understand that if those regions would be returned to Ukraine, then you would have exactly the same thing that happened in 2014 with those paramilitary forces that in fact exerted revenge operation against the civilian population. And you had massacres in Odessa, in Mariupol, in some places. And that's the Russian today want to avoid that. And
So now that leads to a bit of a challenge, which I think that you've shown in some of the maps that you've shown in previous times you were on our show, is that demographically there's still quite a number of ethnic Russians on the Ukraine side of even those four oblast borders. And so it would seem that Russia will have to have some sort of assurances that the Ukraine constitution will have to be amended for those Russians on that side of the line. Or, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong here, that may give Russia incentive to not agree to stop at those four lines.
Well, that's exactly where we have a question mark today, because I don't know to which point the Russians can say, okay, we have the four region. In fact, there should be something like 8 region that would be with not necessarily a majority, but a significant part of the population, which is ethnically Russian. But now they have 4 regions, and certainly they will keep that, because at least the population in those 4 regions is protected by the Russian government. Now, and remember that even in 2014, in the year between 2014 and 2022, the Ukrainian government refused to pay the pensions, for instance, of those of the people in the Donbas region. They refused. They even blocked all the bank services. They refused all the payments, like civil, social allowances and things like this. And for that reason, then the Russian government, from Russia, allowed the population of the Donbas to apply for Russian citizenship. And then, if they had Russian citizenship, they were entitled to receive allowance from Moscow for pensions, for unemployment allowance, family allowances, social allowances, and things like this, because otherwise those people in Donbas were completely abandoned from Kiev, and they were left without any resources. So we see that the commitment of Moscow for the ethnic Russians that are around Russia is very strong, and it's not just a military issue. It's something which is deeply into the soul of the Russians.
Well, and I think that's why when you heard Lavrov say the root causes, I believe that he's talking about all that stuff you just mentioned.
This is exactly that.
And now then, here's start of this dilemma. As we've titled this show here, there's no common ground between the two sides. Here is, Gary, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. I hope I don't throw you too much of a wrench. But if you can bring up the Ukrainian parliamentarian, because he's going to give a comment on Fox News yesterday of the 3 things that Ukraine needs.
In my personal view, there are 3 things. First is our territorial integrity de jure, meaning that occupied territories, Ukrainian territories by Russians, yes, they will be controlled by Russians after the end of hostilities, at least part of them, but they are Ukrainian territories. That is very important for us to keep this non-recognition policy, because one day the last colonial empire in Europe will fall apart, speaking about Russia, and Ukraine will regain control over territories. Number 2 is sovereignty, meaning that Ukraine makes its own choices about what army to have, what military production to expand, and what alliances to join. This is very important. Number 3 is security guarantees, meaning that, first of all, definitely from European Union and European countries, meaning what will prevent Russia from attacking again. So these are 3 things. Again, territorial integrity de jure, sovereignty, and security guarantees, which I think should be our red lines.
Yeah, those seem categorically contrasted to the Russian side.
Well, it is. First of all, the reality on the ground is such as the Russians occupy 20% of Ukrainian territory, that on that territory you have people who are essentially Russian, and for the reason I explained before, the Russians will certainly not give those territories back to Ukraine. The second aspect is that is sovereignty, and essentially the problem of the alliance. Now, here there is a principle that the Russians have always mentioned, and it's deliberately forgotten in our media. This is the principle of indivisibility of security, which is a principle that has been adopted, in particular in the Astana Declaration, which is a OSCE document that, in essence, explains that you cannot build your security at the expense of another one, of your neighbors. And therefore, there must be, your security must also be or contribute to the security of your neighbor in a certain sense. But it cannot be that you decide that your security can can step over the security of others. And this is exactly what the Russians have discussed as regards to the expansion of NATO. And the problem is here that NATO in its substance, but also the US policy, in particular, the policy that was applied since 2002 onwards by the US, the Bush administration in particular, that abandoned or dropped all the disarmament agreements. In particular, the first one in 2002 was the anti-ballistic missile that allowed then the US to enter into discussion with Poland, Czech Republic, and Romania to install anti-ballistic missile or systems in these countries. The problem is that those missiles, they might be anti-ballistic. The problem is that they can also accommodate ballistic missiles. And therefore, they could be a problem for the security of Russia. We are exactly at the same point that we had in 1962 when the US administration decided to deploy the Jupiter missile in Turkey at the border with Soviet Union. And that's exactly what triggered the Cuba missile crisis, because then Soviet Union said, okay, you put your missiles at my border, so I put missile on your border. And eventually that led to the problem we know about. And the Russians withdrew their missiles from Cuba, but the US also removed their missiles from Turkey, because this was exactly the same situation. And that's exactly what the Astana Declaration says about the indivisibility of security.
Yeah.
The third point...
sorry, go ahead.
The third point is about the security guarantees. And here we have, he mentioned the security guarantees of the European Union. So here, honestly, if I were him, I would not trust too much the Europeans for security guarantees, because the capacity they have are probably not sufficient for that. But let's
let me ask you a question on that. I'm glad you brought that up. When you look at a chart that shows the size of the European ground forces in NATO, I think Poland is at the top with 200,000. France is right below that with about 200,000. Then it starts going down there. I think at least, that's the one right there. Thanks, Gary. Yeah. At least on paper, UK is 184. I think they probably have less than that. The actual combat capacity of all those, Poland might be at the top of the list even in combat capacity, but everything below that, that's the peacetime numbers. There has not been any kind of, I guess, not even a move for a semi-war footing by any of those folks right there. They don't have much combat power. They don't have their industrial capacity. Defense industrial capacity is still at a peacetime level, which means relatively low. Whereas the Russians is at, if not full on wartime capacity and economy, something close to it, but definitely cranking at high speed. In the event of any clash between the two sides, i.e., if Ukraine was relying on Europe to fight a conventional war on their behalf, if it went to an Article 5 situation, can NATO actually engage with Russia right now?
Well, there are different aspects here. The first one is that if you go by the figures that you just show, we have to see that these are figures on paper. And if you read the press those days, you will see that what you have on paper is not exactly what you have in reality. I think among all the tanks and tank battalions that the UK has, only one is fit for combat, for instance, and think like this. We have seen, for instance, and that was a complaint by the Ukrainians, by the way, that the French have excellent mobile howitzer, the Caesar system, which is excellent. The problem is that it was not designed for this kind of conflict, meaning that it was very good in Afghanistan, but it delivered very poorly in Ukraine. Why? Because it's a high precision weapon that is not suited for high rate of fire. And it's exactly what the Russians are dragging the Ukrainians into. It's a conflict where the higher rate of fire works. It's a little bit like having a sniper rifle against a machine gun.
Yeah.
That's a little bit that. And we have inadequate armies for now, because I should say Western armies in the last 30 years have been designed for overseas warfare,
Counterinsurgency stuff.
projection warfare. I mean, you know that better than me. Probably the last exception was the first Gulf War, where you had kind of conventional war, some kind of. But after that, the Western armies were in fact committed against, in fact, in counterinsurgency type of warfare, which requires totally different type of equipment, different type of rate of fire. That's where we developed the concept of sniping artillery. And in Ukraine, it's not about sniping artillery. It's about the mass of fire you can deliver within one minute on one spot. It's not if you have a precision thing. Again, this is the difference between a sniper rifle and a machine gun. It's exactly the same analogy. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that NATO is an alliance that was built around the use of nuclear weapons. In essence, NATO is the way to bring European forces under the US nuclear umbrella. That's the essence of NATO. Meaning that when you go into a conflict which is subnuclear, NATO is too strong for that. And that's the reason why nobody wants to use or invoke NATO or Article 5, because then you can drift towards the nuclear forces. That's the NATO is oversized for this kind of conflict. And that's the reason why.
But then correct me if I'm wrong, they're undersized for a strictly conventional conflict.
No, it's oversized in a concept. The idea of NATO is it was designed. Remember that NATO was created just after the Europeans discovered that Soviet Union had the nuclear weapon. And they realized that the US had a nuclear weapon, that the Soviet Union had nuclear, but they had none. And therefore, they had to find a way to be protected by some kind of nuclear deterrence. And for that reason, NATO was created. And that's the Washington Treaty that, in essence, brings all the Europeans under the nuclear umbrella of the US. But to go to Afghanistan, that was okay. But you see that if you had NATO now involved in Europe, the risk of drifting towards nuclear war is enormous.
So then when Zelensky is talking about he wants security guarantees, he ultimately means a nuclear security guarantee.
Exactly. That's also part of the problem, because you remember that in the last couple of months, he mentioned several times that he would like to have nuclear weapons, and that if he cannot join NATO, the US or whoever should provide him with nuclear weapons. So this is a kind of extremely dangerous posture that we have, and that's the reason why, in fact, everything that could happen if you have a war in Europe below the level of nuclear engagement, that cannot happen under NATO. And that's the reason why I think, and I remember when I was in NATO, I had some colleagues and even those who are planning for the future development of NATO, they were thinking about this because and Jens Stoltenberg repeated several times that NATO is a nuclear alliance. And that's the reason why, when it came to providing some security guarantees to Ukraine, individual countries had to sign bilateral treaties with Ukraine. And you have those 28 countries that signed bilateral security agreement, because otherwise, if you involve NATO, you have the risk to go into a nuclear war.
As a matter of fact, this is a perfect place to insert this, because I can presume that Zelensky was actually meaning a security guarantee, but I don't actually have to presume it because he pretty much made it clear himself.
Will we be given nuclear weapons? Then let them give us nuclear weapons. Will they give us the missiles in the quantities that we can stop Russia? And I'm not sure of that, but I think it would help. Otherwise, what missiles can stop Russia's nuclear missiles? That is a rhetoric question. So let's do it the following way. Give us back nuclear arms, give us missile systems. Partners, help us finance the 1 million army, move your contingent on the parts of our state where we want the stability of the situation so that the people have tranquility.
I mean, what could be more tranquil and stable than to introduce nuclear weapons into the calculation?
This is just incredible. We have this kind of behavior, and this is when you see the quite immature type of leadership we have in Europe with Kaja Kallas, Annalena Baerbock, Ursula von der Leyen, Emmanuel Macron, and even Keir Starmer. These are individuals that hardly understand what is the meaning of the word war. And in fact, to some extent, I would say it's good that nuclear force or nuclear power is under US control, because apparently the US are more, let's say, concerned about what could be the implications of nuclear warfare than the Europeans are. And that's very strange, but this is the reality. And that's why I think if we have to rethink the security architecture in Europe or in the West at large, including Canada and the US, we have to find ways where you can have a war, escalate a war without reaching the nuclear level, because we have people who are so lunatic in Europe. I mean, look at the Baltic states. These guys would, without any problem, launch missiles at Moscow, without realizing that Moscow can reply. And this is just amazing. And that's the same with Zelensky. He doesn't realize 1 second that having a missile and launching a missile against Russia could probably trigger some reaction.
This is a statement, I think. Because you're getting back into the disputes or the differences between how people are viewing this. I want to bring Gary in because we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit to the U.S. side. Gary, by the way, because something that the Colonel just mentioned there about that Trump seems to understand stuff that others don't. Do you have that clip of him on Maria Bartiromo talking about the nuclear weapons?
Sure. Where he's talking about Iran a little bit also?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me pull that up. Just
Yeah, okay. He's gonna
riff for
he's gonna
for
pull
a
that
second
up.
or two.
The
Oh, I've got it. Here
context
we go.
first of this video is about Iran, but you'll see in a second it's really about nuclear weapons.
Something's going to happen one way or the other. I hope that Iran, and I've written them a letter saying, I hope you're going to negotiate, because if we have to go in militarily, it's going to be a terrible thing for them.
You wrote a letter to the Khomeini,
Yes.
the leader? When did you send the letter?
Yesterday. We spend a lot of money on nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons. The level of destruction is beyond anything you can even imagine. It's just bad that everybody has to spend all this money on something that if it's used, it's probably the end of the world. I watched Biden for years say the existential threat. He loved the term existential threat. Is our greatest existential
That's
threat
probably enough right
is
there, Gary. We can
the
just pull up that.
climate. I said,
His point that it's probably the end of the world. He does understand that. So that seems to be the U.S. side of this. So it almost looks like that the Russian side and the U.S. side are closer to an understanding of a reality of what the ground actually looks like. And Gary, if you could bring up that full screen of Rubio, because here's the U.S. heading in there. It seems to me that we're focused on, well, let's see if we can first of all get the cutoff resolved, because they haven't done it yet. Trump put a freeze on all that stuff, even though he's taking a lot of heat for it, because it seems to me, and you and I were talking about this before we came on the air, that Keith Kellogg a couple of days ago likened the cutoff of this to hitting a mule upside the head with a 2-4 to get its attention. Is that what's happening here?
Well, this is I think the problem is that the Ukrainians, because they have the support of the Europeans, they are reluctant to go to the negotiation table because they have too much to lose, if you want, because they know they will have to lose. There is no way around that. If there is, and I think even Donald Trump said so, that if there is, the end of the war would be at Russian terms. So on Russian terms. So there is no question on that. Now, the problem is that you have to force the Ukrainians to go to the negotiation table. And as I said before, I said it's very hard to get a donkey to drink if he doesn't want to drink. It's a say in French that you say, it's a say you cannot force a donkey to drink if he doesn't want to drink. But in fact, the efforts of the U.S. diplomacy, as I understand it, and as it unfolds in Saudi Arabia right now, is to find a way to constrain the Ukrainians to accept a discussion with the Russians. It's not about defining what will be the content of the discussion. I think I don't know. I'm not in the palace in Riyadh, but my understanding is that the main effort of the U.S. at the moment is to convince Zelensky to drink the water, if you want.
Gary, you've been following the U.S. side of this probably more closely than I have. I've been focused on the European side there. Do you think that's is that what you've been seeing with some of the comments coming from some of the various U.S. leaders?
I think Colonel Jacques is the bullseye there. Exactly right. Yeah, Colonel Jacques, I've been saying to Danny that I think at this meeting they're basically going to read the Ukrainians a riot act and say, you either get in line or we're gone. You're doing this alone. You're doing it without America if you don't do exactly what we've put down and telling you to do right now.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if the Europeans, the Europeans will defend until to the last point this idea that you shouldn't talk to Putin. That's a kind of mantra, period. They don't know exactly why. I know why, because to some extent, but it's very irrational. I told you, a friend of mine was the Swiss ambassador in Kiev. It was Claude Wild. He was the Swiss ambassador until last year. And he said that having a negotiation with the Russians would be kind of a reward for the aggressor, you know? And
How
he's an
backwards is that?
ambassador. It's very strange because the purpose of diplomacy is precisely to find solution in very difficult situation. You are not trying to judge whether you punish. It's not a punisher that has to sanction people and all that. The diplomat has to find a way to accommodate the views of both parties in order to solve a problem. But that's not the way the Europeans see it, and that is something extremely concerning for the. But on the other hand, this is exactly what we have seen since the very beginning of this conflict: the total absence of diplomacy, especially European diplomacy. So why would you have now a change in that? I mean, we have seen no European diplomacy in 3 years. I mean, the diplomacy, the European diplomacy, and when I say European diplomacy, there are two levels here. There's one, the diplomacy of individual states. I mean, important states such as France, Italy, UK, Germany. And here you can see that the diplomacy has never worked in order to soften the situation. It was to exacerbate the situation systematically. The only real diplomats that we have seen during those last 3 years were in fact Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, who tried to find solution and tried to explain a different approach to solve the issue. But the other ones never want. That's the first level. The second level is the European Union level. European Union level, I mean, the head of the External Action Service, which is the foreign service of the European Union, was Josep Borrell until last year, and now it's Kaja Kallas. So Josep Borrell did nothing, virtually nothing. He is viscerally against Vladimir Putin and the Russians. And today you have Kaja Kallas, who used to be the prime minister of one of the smallest countries of Europe without any significant economic, military, or political influence. In addition to that, it's a net recipient of European aid. It doesn't contribute to the European Union. It receives aid, but it doesn't provide any. I mean, France, Germany are net donors, if you want, for the European Union. And Eastern countries, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, are net recipients, and Estonia is one of them. So you have this, she used to be prime minister of such a country that, in addition of having no political influence per se, in addition to that, their only focus is to fight against Russia. This is their mentality. This is their culture. This is the way they did since the country existed. And even in addition to that, they have minorities in their own countries that are not even allowed to be normal citizens of their countries.
Yeah, so, they don't want to talk about that very much. Gary, one other participant in the Riyadh meeting, I'm sorry, the Jeddah meeting starting tomorrow is going to be Mike Walls. And from some of the clips that you found of him talking, I think he seems to be more inclined to agreeing with Colonel Baud here than with General Sirski, for example. How do you think he's going to be leading these talks?
Yeah, very much so. I think, as Colonel Jacques was just saying, that somehow the Europeans are under the illusion that they can somehow strong-arm Russia, America into signing up onto what their vision of the future is. And Mike Walls made it very clear that there is no way they're going down that road. And again, we've heard Trump repeatedly say, you know, I'll say goodbye. I'll say goodbye and you're on your own. You know, go find the deal that you think you can find, which is there is no other deal to be had. So again, they've got this illusion that they're not willing to surrender at all. They're just pushing until the end. But I think Rubio, Mike Walls, are going to put an end to that ultimately.
And I feel like I need to put this up there. Talking about delusion, Colonel, I want your view on this. Gary, if you could put that full screen up from Zelensky, who's saying, man, the only impediment to this war has been those darn Russians. He says Ukraine has been seeking peace since the very first second of the war, and we have always said that the only reason the war is continuing is because of Russia. What say you?
Well, this is a very strange comment, because in fact the whole issue came after the fact, and literally the fact, that Ukraine didn't want to implement the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement was an agreement between the leadership of the two republics of Donbass and Lugansk, or I mean, more precisely, parts of the Lugansk and Donetsk oblasts, and Kiev. It was not an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, as many think. It was a treaty internal treaty within Ukraine. And you had Russia on the side of the autonomists, and Germany and France on the side of Kiev, who were the guarantors of this treaty. Now, the problem is that Petro Poroshenko, who was the president when the agreement was signed, then Volodymyr Zelensky, then Angela Merkel, who was the German guarantor, and François Hollande, who was the French guarantor of the treaty, all four of them confessed in between 2021 and 2022, they confessed that they had never in mind the implementation of the agreement. That for them, the agreement had as a sole purpose the rearmament of Ukraine and the preparation of Ukraine for further conflict. So, in fact, they fooled the Russians and the Donbass leaders, and they admitted that. And that was very clear. And in the recent, and that when the small video you showed of Lavrov commenting on what Macron said, the Russians were furious, because in his address last Friday, Emmanuel Macron said that the Russians breached the Minsk agreement. And in fact, he was the one who breached the agreement. And we have a testimony of that, because I don't know if I have the slide here I can show, because that was published at one point, that he tried. I can show that. Sorry, just here we go. You see that. Macron, during a phone call that, by the way, was recorded, because he had a journalist in his office when he had this conversation with Vladimir Putin, and the whole conversation was recorded, and it was later published, and we have the verbatim of that meeting. And the title of this article says, "We don't care about the separatist proposal," shows exactly that Emmanuel Macron never read the Minsk agreement, because the Minsk agreement was precisely to establish or to force the Kiev government to talk to the autonomists. By the way, we're not separatists, but autonomists. In the Minsk agreement, it was never a question of separating the two republics from Ukraine. It was about integrating those two republics into Ukraine, but having a federal system very similar to what you have in the United States or in Switzerland. By the way, the person or the diplomat who helped to design or to draft the agreement, the Minsk agreement, was a Swiss ambassador. That was Heidi Tagliavini. She was ambassador for the OSCE, and she helped to draft the Minsk Agreement. And of course, she took as an example the Swiss federalist system, where each canton or state has its own autonomy in terms of religion, language, and administration and different things. And that's exactly what that was the idea of the Minsk Agreement. But Emmanuel Macron just said, well, we don't care about the separatists, meaning that he didn't understand what was the purpose of this agreement. And he was the one, in fact, who broke the agreement. And that's the reason why the Russians are so furious about him, because
and have
the
such
Russians
little
understand that
trust as
very well.
Say, listen, in just the last few minutes we have here, sticking with the theme of delusion and just not dealing with the realities of the fact that this is, which unfortunately is really common in a lot of the things we've shown here. I want to put up here this quote by General Sursky, which just popped up on the Kiev Independent, or I think it was Kiev Independent about an hour before we came on air here. There's all in the news today about that the Kursk is collapsing and it's just falling apart. There's a lot of evacuations from the Ukraine side. Russia's pouring in at least on 4 different directions, according to even Western analysis here. But Sursky, the commander-in-chief, says there is currently no threat of encirclement of our units in the Kursk Oblast. The units are taking timely measures to maneuver to favorable defensive lines. Sursky wrote in Facebook, Ukrainian forces, quote, control the situation, he said, on the ground between Sumy and the Kursk Oblast. Do you see any evidence that that is true?
Well, that's part of the delusion. Well, of course, we are not on the spot, and we know that there's a lot of fog of war regarding what's happening there. My view is that he's wrong, but again, I may be wrong because I'm not on the spot. What's certain is that the purpose of going into Kursk to have kind of a strategic advantage for negotiating with the Russians, to allow some swap or territory swap or something like that, this will certainly not happen. Meaning that regardless whether the troops in this the Kursk or the Sudzha pocket can escape, that might be the case. I don't know whether or not this will happen. What's certain is that the idea of having a territorial spot and have a swap and having so many people dying in Kursk was useless. That's certainly the what we can say, regardless of whether or not these soldiers will be able to escape or not. The operation was a complete failure. It was designed, and we say that that's very interesting because Sudzha is not a strategic place as such. Yeah. But in the mind of Zelensky, it had strategic importance because it was supposed to be used in negotiation to have a card in the hands. And now this card is lost.
Turned out to be a 2, I think. Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today and really making very clear what we're looking at heading into the meeting in Jeddah tomorrow. And I think it's pretty clear what's probably going to come out of that. We'll have to wait and see. But Gary, I wonder if you can, because this is not all we got today, Gary. Don't we have another show, one more today, right?
Oh yeah, sure. We got Larry the Shirt Johnson coming in from Russia. So he's been having some meetings there that he's going to be able to tell us about. That's what we're looking forward to. So at 3:30 today.
I'm told we have some information. He sent me something on Signal a little while ago that said he has some insider insight into what the Russians are thinking about this whole ceasefire deal. We didn't get time to go into it here, but there's some crazy ideas coming out from the Western side on that too. But I think you know how that's going to end up. But anyway, Colonel, just really appreciate you coming on today, and we always value your time here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And nice thank you guys, too, for coming on. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on your way out. And Gary and I, along with Larry the Shirt Johnson, you're not going to want to miss that. And that's always a good dynamic we have between the three of us anyway. You'll want to see what he has to say straight from Moscow at 3:30 today. Thanks, and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.